Hi, everybody.
Yeah, good afternoon.
This is Reverend Liddy Barlow.
This is Rabbi Ron Symons.
Liddy is the executive minister of Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania. So that means for you Christian folk, is that okay? Can you say it that way?
Oh, you could say that.
Okay. That means that she is your umbrella organization for some 2,000 churches all around Southwest Pennsylvania.
Perfect. And Ron is the Senior Director of Jewish Life at the Jewish Community Center in Greater Pittsburgh, where he serves as Founding Director of the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement, where they seek to redefine neighbor from a geographic term to a moral concept.
So I'm really in an awkward position because often when we have these conversations, right, I refer to Liddy as my senior pastor, right? And I have to acknowledge that I also have my senior rabbi, right? Although I'm not sure she's quite here because she's on sabbatical, right? So I'm very fortunate for her that you're here. It's a mirage.
It's a little blurry around the edges.
And of course, Pastors Bob and David are here, and so we're grateful for the support and for bringing us here to have a conversation with you over the course of the next hour through Scripture, through Mr. Rogers, through our lived, shared experience, our divergent experiences over the course of the past year and a half, 2 years or so.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk for a while, but we're a small group and we're pretty casual just usually. And so if your questions arise over the course of the presentation and you want to raise your hand and ask them, please feel totally free. We will also take some time for a discussion after we conclude too.
Ready?
So off we go.
Let's give it a shot. That's you.
So we want to begin with a particularly grim moment in 20th century history. As you know, the Holocaust did not begin all at one time. Rather, it began through a series of shifts in attitude and shifts in the law. But on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, the sense of bigotry and hatred led by the Nazi Party turned into acts of violence. Synagogues, Jewish businesses, Jewish community organizations, and the homes of Jewish people were attacked that night, leading to casualties, destruction of property, and death. Oh, too far. So Kristallnacht is when the Holocaust turns from a time of hatred that is ideological to one that is violent. And it's when people began to be sent to concentration camps, leading to what Hitler called the final solution.
I think we use the button.
I think we'll just use the button.
No, so it's over here.
Yeah.
So let's go with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the synagogue furnishings in Venn, Germany. So let's just take a look. And I know that we are a diverse crowd, so there might be some very strong familiarity with some of the images here, and there might be some newness to these images. Let's begin to identify, as if it were a painting in a museum, what is it that we see in the foreground of the painting or the picture? Anyone want to call out anything that you see that, oh, gee, that looks familiar? I can identify that, especially since we're diverse, not everyone might know everything.
Bedroom furniture.
Say it again?
Bedroom furniture.
Bedroom furniture? Right? So you think that this looks like it's a bed rail or whatnot. Mm-hmm. So now, we're all church people, you know what I mean by that, right? That's a loving term, right, of all of us, right? If it's not bedroom furniture, what would it be?
Pew.
It's a pew, right? So you have pews here, you have pews over here, right? What do you notice about those pews?
They're destroyed.
They're destroyed, they're upended, right? What else do you see in the picture?
Is there an ark in the back?
Yeah, I think that's what this is, right? If you look here, you see the tablets of the Ten Commandments, right? Which is a very common theme in synagogues, above or near the ark in which the Torah is placed. I also see a lampstand here, right? And now let's move towards the background of it. What do you see back over here?
People watching.
People watching. Who are the people?
Look like children.
They look like children. Why are the children there? They're curious
To witness.
to witness, because this guy is not a child, right? He's a stormtrooper. So what do you think is about to happen here?
You're going to be burned.
They're about to burn up, right, the materials, the innards of the synagogue. And the children have been brought there to witness. The children have been brought there to witness. Here is what we do to the stuff, the sacred stuff of those other people. Those people who don't deserve to be able to gather as they wish. Those people who are different than us. That's a part of history that is just horrific. And we might very well think that, well, you know, it's been, 75 years? It happened over there, right? So we don't really have to worry about that here in America. After all, it is America, right? And then we can look here. And it's probably pretty contemporaneous. I mean, if you look at the way that people are dressed, you know, maybe it's the 30s, maybe it's just a couple of years before. But we live in a society where we would, and still do, otherize people. And people come and bear witness to say, here is what we do to someone who's not like us.
That our ideologies have turned into actual violence here in the United States as well. And that's not just something that happened 80 years ago. Because on October 27th of 2018, this was the scene in Squirrel Hill. Now there's something really importantly different about this scene from the scenes above. What is it?
Police are responding. Coming to help.
Yeah, exactly. So the people in uniform in this picture are not just standing idly by or encouraging onlookers to stand idly by and to take notice of violence, but instead are rushing towards to help.
And our hope, of course, is that the helpers, the people that we invest with authority to help, are going to help no matter who the victims are going to help no matter what the circumstances are going to help without any regard for economics, for race, for ethnicity, for skin tone, and whatnot. We don't live in that more perfect union yet, right? But that's the dream, that we're going to get there. And then when people needed to gather, they gathered here. This is around 5 p.m. on October 27th, 2018. That's the library. Up over there, Squirrel Hill, the corner of Forbes and Murray. Coldstone Creamery. The picture's being taken from the steps of 6th Presby. JCC is over here, Rite Aid in the JCC. This was organized by teenagers. They actually started texting me saying, we need to do something, we need to do something. Will you do it? JCC. And we looked at the presidents of the congregations and we said, people want to do something, what do you think? And they said, we don't even know who's dead yet. How can we do something? And we said to them, well, they're going to do something. And we said, fine, let's let them do something. But we need to wait. But look at how the gathering of energy can be for positive, can be for comfort, can be for community, as opposed to otherization.
So I was there last night, actually standing probably pretty close to where this picture was taken. And some of you in the room, was anyone in the room also there that evening? My main memory of that evening was parking my car at some distance away because parking was scarce, putting up my umbrella because it was an extremely gloomy October day, and walking towards this corner and having this sense that everyone around me, every other pedestrian on the road, was also under their umbrella walking in the same direction. That we were all kind of drawn like a magnet to be together in that moment, and to find some kind of community in such a dark time.
I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Now, doesn't that bring just good feelings to you, right? Whether you grew up with Fred as a neighbor in Squirrel Hill, in Pittsburgh, or as I did growing up in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood on East 56th in Brooklyn, right? Because I would watch that every day. And that concept of being a neighbor, he didn't invent it. It goes back to our shared faith traditions. And so what we'd like to do over the course of the next several minutes or so is to walk into that expression of what does it mean to be a neighbor. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah, all right. Good. So that corner of Forbes and Murray, it was powerful on that day. It's powerful to go back from memory. And I'll just say that for many of us also, it was powerful because it's where one of the first funerals actually processed, right, during that week. Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz had his funeral at the JCC. I served as executive director, essentially, to make sure that everything was in order, make sure that we could seat 400 people in the auditorium, another 200 in the hallway, another 500 or 600 in the gymnasium. And then when we were done, I got outside, and I saw this group of Orthodox Jews standing behind the hearse. And they said to me, "Did you make arrangements for us?" And I think to myself, what? They said, "We're going to walk. Did you tell the police?" I said, "No, but I will." So I went to the helpers, and I said, "They're going to walk." They said, "Okay." I said to them, "Okay, you can walk." And I figured that I was going to go on to whatever the next urgent thing I needed to do was. But when they started walking, my feet just went with them. And so we made a left from Darlington onto Murray, and then a right from Murray onto Forbes, right, that very same corner. And as we were walking, people were stopping. Not just traffic, but people on the sidewalks were stopping, were saluting, were crying. And it really gave that sense of neighborhood. This wasn't just the funeral of one person, it was our collective experience together. How beautiful for such a lovely man as Jerry, right, for that to happen. I will tell you that for me, it was one of the most spiritual things I did that week, right? Walking to a funeral. I've never walked behind a hearse, right? I drive. But boy, there was something neighborhood about that. And so we want to explore what that love your neighbor actually looks like, where it comes from, and why.
Exactly. Yeah. What does it mean for us to walk together, not just literally, but also spiritually? And how does that idea of loving our neighbors get rooted in our scriptures in so many different faith traditions?
That's not going to work.
I really want it to work.
So here's the verse. Here's the origins of it. Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, ani Adonai. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. For those of us that spend some time in synagogue, it sounds kind of familiar. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. The greatest commandment. We'll get back to that in a little bit. In Deuteronomy is you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your being. Ve'ahavta. Ve'ahavta. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai, your God. It comes straight from the book of Leviticus, actually from the heart of Leviticus, in a section called Kedoshim, Holiness, the Holiness Code, where it spells out, here's how you're supposed to live your life, right? The big principles of how you live your life. And then, we often think that this concept of love of God really isn't a Jewish concept. Right? Because we have this myth, and I know that I'm amidst enough friends and enough Christian scholars, right, to confirm this, that it's not that the God of the Hebrew Bible is the law God and the God of the Christian Bible is the love God. We share love and law combined together. And in fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs teaches us that the great gift of Judaism and Christianity, he doesn't put in there Islam, but I will, is that the key is that it's about love. That love is how we're going to transform this world. We got to keep that in mind, that that's what we all share, especially in hard times.
And we see this in the teachings of Jesus in the Christian Bible as well. The first time that this concept of loving your neighbor comes up in our scriptures is in the 5th chapter of Matthew. And those of you who are in Christian traditions that follow the Revised Common Lectionary just read from the 5th chapter of Matthew this morning. You might remember that that's part of of a set of Jesus' teachings called the Sermon on the Mount. It's unclear to scholars whether Jesus ever actually stood up and read that from a manuscript on a mountain all in one piece. But it became a compilation of Jesus' greatest hits albums, the most important teachings of Jesus. One of the ways that Jesus collects his information in the Sermon on the Mount is by using this phrase over and over again, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." When Christians read that, usually it's "you have heard it said," and then some kind of outlandishly awful thing. And then, "but I say to you," with Jesus swooping in as a new teacher. It's important for us to know that Jesus is not referring to Judaism when he says, "You have heard it said." He's actually arguing with weird and incorrect interpretations of Judaism by other Jewish teachers, because of course Jesus himself was a Jewish teacher. So Jesus says, wait, no, I'm still on that one actually, sorry, I'm just talking sorry about that one. So Jesus says, you heard it said that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's not a teaching of Judaism, that you should love your neighbor but hate your enemy. There's no column of people you should hate in traditional Judaism. Instead, classic Judaism would agree with what Jesus says next, which is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That love is indeed the sort of compass of the world.
Even the Ravens fans?
Me. In Luke's Gospel, there's a wonderful story where a lawyer stands up to test Jesus. That's how Luke describes it. So this is a person who has some expertise, but is also looking to trip Jesus up, trying to sort of catch him off guard. And the lawyer asks Jesus, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, who has been around the block a couple times and knows what it's like when someone asks you trick questions, says, well, okay, what do you read in the law? What's already in there? And the guy's like, well, it says I should love the Lord my God and I should love my neighbor. Jesus was like, well, great. Yes, you are right. Go do that. So then the lawyer asks the trickiest question of all, which is, who is my neighbor? Now, when he asks this question, he's not actually really looking for moral advice. He's looking for Jesus to draw a boundary and define who we don't have to love. Who are the people who are outside?
Browns.
Exactly. Who are outside. But Jesus doesn't answer the question straight. Instead, he tells a story. I tried. There we go. Instead, he tells a story. It's a story that we've sort of come to know as the story of the Good Samaritan, right? That a man was beaten and robbed, that a series of people passed by on the other side of the street without stopping to help. Among them were religious leaders. And again, this is a tricky place for Christians. There's times when we've read this story and said, oh, well, this chief priest and the Levite must not have really loved God if they passed their neighbor by, without paying attention to the kind of restrictions that were placed on their practice of faith.
The reality is that for those chief priests, those high priests in those days, if they were to have stopped to help someone who had been injured or died, they would have been impure and would not have been able to do temple sacrifices. So they were working within their system as opposed to working out of a moral insensitivity.
So then a third person comes along the street, and it's a person that you would never expect to be part of the story at all. It's a Samaritan, a member of a rival ethnic group, a rival religious group.
Patriots.
As if your Ravens fan came along and saw the injured person in black and gold and tenderly bandaged them, is what happens in this story. So after Jesus tells this story, he turns back and keep going. And he turns to the lawyer who asked the question, and Jesus asks him a question right back. Which one of these three was a neighbor? Was it the priest? Was it the Levite? Was it the Samaritan? Which one was a neighbor? And the lawyer very grudgingly says, the one who showed him mercy. He can't even bear to say the word, the Samaritan. Jesus says, go and do likewise. And what I think is genius about the way Jesus handles this is that the lawyer asked him, who is my neighbor? Help me draw a boundary. What's the least that I have to love? And Jesus flips that question on its head. Not who is my neighbor, but who was a neighbor? Who can I neighbor? Who neighbors me? Jesus turns neighbor from a noun into a verb. And suggests that in our moral life, we should go and do likewise, not worrying about who the boundaries of our neighbors might be, but instead seeking to neighbor other people.
And so the question is this lesson, right, which comes from the Hebrew Bible, it comes from the Christian Bible, it comes from other faith traditions as well, it comes from Mr. Rogers. Is that just quaint? Or is it something that we really need to be focusing in on today? So when you look back around 1,000 years ago into a midrash, Tana Dve Eliyahu, God says the only thing that I want you to do for each other is to love each other and to honor each other. The core basic principle of how it is that we should live together in community. And in the Baha'i community, ascribe not to any soul that which you wouldn't do to have ascribed to thee, and say not that which thou didst not. Blessed is he who prefers his brother before himself. We're going to see over and over again that these principles of some flipping, some turning of the golden rule of love your neighbor as yourself, right, is present in tradition after tradition. And we're pretty confident that Fred knew that as well. After all, he was pastor. And Fred teaches that every human being has value. This is the basis of all healthy relationships. Through living each day as it was given to me, I've learned that it cannot be taught, but it can be taught from those who live their lives right along with us. What a privilege to be able to look for the good in our neighbor. Imagine what it would be like if every time you went on to Miracle Mile, right, and you had a challenging situation with somebody, but somehow you found the good in that person. So in Judaism, we've got this great concept that says that all Jews are responsible for one another. That's why when you see a headline about Bernie Madoff, I think it was in the headlines this past week, in fact, about his health or something of that sort, that Jews say, oh my God, I can't believe that Bernie Madoff is Jewish. Or that's why when you hear a headline about Jerry Seinfeld, right, and who doesn't like Jerry Seinfeld, right? Well, we're so proud that he's Jerry Seinfeld. There is this connectivity, right, among Jews in good times and in bad times.
And we see that in Christianity as well. When you have, from the writings of the Apostle Paul, this idea of all Christians being connected as if we were one body, right? So some people are like fingers, and some people are like the liver, and some people are like the kneecap, or whatever. And more specifically, Paul writes that all people are like a body. Well, whose body? Well, like the body of Christ. That somehow the presence of God in today's society is made up of the existence of individual Christians, all connected to one another and all acting much as Jesus might have done in the world.
What we've come to learn through our shared experience and our shared study is that we are universally particularistic. All of us really have this great desire to be with like-minded people, right? To go to church with our people, to go to temple with our people, to hang out with them. But we need to understand that our sense of chosenness, our sense of being better than others, all of us have that somewhere deep down inside. And maybe we should focus more simply on what we are connected to each other as opposed to how we're different from each other. And so actually, Martin Buber, a great 20th century philosopher, who, I need to admit, he was Jewish, right? But I know that Christian theologians look to Buber and find a lot in him as well. He's like this bridge between Jews and Christians in theology and philosophy. He kind of tells the story of how one morning you're in your kitchen and you're cutting your bagel, right? And you don't have one of those guillotines or one of those protectors and whatnot. You're holding your bagel in your left hand, you're holding your knife in your right hand, and you accidentally cut your right hand. He says, what don't you do? You don't put down the bagel with your left hand and then pick up the knife with that left hand and stab your right hand out of vengeance. Because we're all a part of one body. We don't take vengeance on each other just because we've been hurt by another aspect of each other. We have to figure out how do we actually work together in all of this.
Right. So that body that we are is bigger than just Jewish and bigger than just Christian. It's everybody. And in Native American spirituality, that idea of interconnectedness, of the interconnectedness of humanity, but also the interconnectedness of humanity with the natural world, is a primary source of understanding and belonging. So if all things are our relatives, what we do to everything we do to ourselves, all is really one, as Black Oak said. It's as if we are indeed all one. And Fred says, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if God and neighbor are somehow one. Loving God and loving neighbor, maybe that's the same thing. Coming to recognize that God loves every neighbor is the ultimate appreciation. In the Christian epistles, so the collection of letters and other writings that come at the after the Gospels, at the end of the Christian Bible, there are several places where Paul and other writers talk about loving your neighbor as the primary directive from God to humankind, right? So that all of the commandments Paul writes are summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. And he repeats that idea in his letters to the Galatians, right? That the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. And then later, the writer of the Epistle of James says, you do well if you fulfill the royal law, right? The king of all laws, to love your neighbor as yourself. In Jesus' own teachings, he was asked once which commandment is the first of all, and Jesus combines the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and love the Lord your God that's the first commandment, and the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandment greater than these, right? So he was asked which one is the most important, and he replies, well, there's really two, and these two are so closely connected with each other that they become the greatest.
And look at how it is that we mirror that in Judaism. When Rabbi Akiva was asked to just sum up the entire Torah in one commandment, he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is the greatest of them all. But he's hanging out with his friend Rabbi Ben Azai, and Ben Azai says, no, Akiva, I can up you by one. It's not, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's that we all were created from the same Adam. We all go back to the same origins. We have the same lineage. It's because of that we know that if I hurt you, I'm hurting myself, I'm hurting God. If you hurt me, you're hurting yourself as well.
And we see the similar teaching in the Hindu tradition, right? This summation of the golden rule out of the Mahabharata: do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you.
And Fred says, as human beings, our job in life is to help people realize how rare and valuable each one of us really is. That each one of us has something that no one else has or ever will have. Something inside that is unique to all time. It's our job to encourage each other to discover that uniqueness and to provide ways of developing its expression. That's the concept of being created in the image of God. It's not that we're all the exact same image, but we somehow mysteriously, I use that for Christians, right?
We like mystery.
Somehow, spiritually, we all have some aspect of that godliness in us, even in our incredible diversity. So how much? How much love do you actually have to give? So love your fellow as yourself. According to Nachmanides around 700 years ago, it's hyperbole. You can't actually love someone as much as you love yourself. That is to say that who here is willing to go to the ATM and to withdraw 50% of all of your money and give it to me? We're just not going to do that. You've got to try to find a balance in it all. And so, in fact, the rabbis have this great conversation that goes back some 2,000 years. If you're in the desert and you only have enough water for one person, but there are two people, what do? David, you laughed. Do you have an answer?
No, I don't.
The rabbis go back and forth on it, But Rabbi Akiva, again, says, listen, the reality is that whoever owns the canteen gets to drink the water. Because that way you can be assured that one person lives. And ownership actually does matter to a certain extent. If you were to split the water, well, that's very loving, but you're both probably going to die. So you need to stay alive for another day.
So the Christian tradition, interestingly, includes a passage where Jesus says, "Sell all your possessions and give them to the poor."
So you can go to the ATM.
We'll see. We've got some time after this. Okay. So our tradition in Christianity has also wrestled with this idea of sacrifice over time. In many times, Christianity has elevated this sense of the virtue of self-sacrifice. But that virtue is not always a reliable place to stand in the world where we're called to serve other people. Go back there.
Sorry.
And the 20th century writer Frederick Buechner, I love this, "A bleeding heart is of no help to anybody if it bleeds to death." Right? That we also have a responsibility to tend to our needs so that we are able to tend to the needs of others.
And so, back to Nachmanides, right? You see that I made this lamed, this first letter that looks like a lightning bolt, extra large. Because it actually doesn't say love your neighbor as yourself. It says show love for your neighbor as yourself. It's as if you were able, you need to have an attitude about the way that you interact with someone, as opposed to going to the ATM and taking out 50% of your money, right? It is a way that we look at each other and say, I can have the respect for you that I hope that you have for me, and I'm going to actually act on it. Because having the respect is one thing, but actually doing something about it is another. And Islam teaches us to serve Allah and join not any partners with Him, and do good to parents, to kinsfolks, to orphans, those in need, neighbors who are near, neighbors who are strangers, the companion by your side, the wayfarer, and what your right hand possesses. For Allah loves not the arrogant, not the vainglorious.
My favorite thing about this particular quotation from the Quran is the phrase, neighbors who are near and neighbors who are strangers, right? That the responsibility is not only for those people with whom we have some kind of relationship, but also to all of those people that we might never meet, and those who are connected to us only through the distant effects of our actions, that they also are to be persons. Yeah. And Fred says that all of us sometime or another need help. Whether we're giving or receiving help, each one of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us as neighbors. In our own way, each of us is a giver and a receiver. There's going to be times when we're in the desert when we have the water. And there's going to be times when we're in the desert and the other person has the water. That there's an ebb and a flow between our neediness and our ability to give. And that's what makes us community together.
So October 27th was Saturday, 28th was Sunday, 29th was Monday. I serve in the Chevra Kadisha, the Burial Society. It's a group of men, in my case, who, when called, go to help prepare people for burial. We got the call, right, that we needed to go and to take care of some of the gentlemen who had died in the synagogue. I got there, the team had already begun taking care of some gentlemen. I was going to join for a third one. I go into the back room of Sugars. I start getting out of my street clothes, putting on my scrubs, and all of a sudden, as I'm in the back of a funeral home on October 29th, on a dreary day in the dark, and the voice from outside says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." I began to freak out a little bit. Luckily, I found Dion. Dion was a funeral director who was working there at Ralph Sugar's, who I had never met before. And I said to her, "Dion, someone's knocking on your door." I said, "I think you should open it up." And I like to think in my memory that I stood right alongside her when she did, but I think I was about 5 feet behind, right? And she had to first unengage the security system, the alarm system, right? Which was a folding chair, right up in there. She took that away. She opened up the door, and this little woman thrust 10 $100 bills in her face and said, "This is for the married couple."
Oh.
Dion said, "What's your name?" She said, "No names." She said, "Can I give you a hug?" She said, "No hugs." And she just slipped away into the darkness. Dion closed the door, put the security system back in, turned to me, holding the money, and the two of us for 5 minutes just wept in each other's arms. Because after incredible darkness, there's goodness. After incredible darkness, there is light. That you never know when you're going to find someone who's going to uplift you. And Fred says that the older I get, the more I seem to be able to appreciate my neighbor, whoever I might happen to be with. Oh, sure, I've always tried to love my neighbor as myself. However, the more experiences I've had, the more chances I've had to see the uniqueness of each person, as well as each tree and plant and shell and cloud, the more I find myself delighting every day in the lavish gifts of God's, whom I've come to believe is the greatest appreciator of all. What if we looked at every person as that possible knock on the door and not assume that they're going to do bad by them? So, in Judaism, we've got this concept of Olam Haba, the world to come. We talk about it in 2 ways. One is in the days of the Messiah. That once the Messiah comes, and I know we have our differences about whether the Messiah came already or not, and whatnot. Let's leave that aside for now, right? But when the Messiah does come, right, that will be the world to come. We also use the concept of Olam Haba, the world to come, for the afterlife in Judaism. That after we die, we go to Olam Haba, not yet a messianic time, but something about our spirit is with God. What I want to suggest is that we don't translate the term Olam Haba as it normally is translated as the world to come, but instead as the world yet to be. And wouldn't you know it, the world yet to be begins right now. And that we have a part, right, in being able to shape that world based on the teachings that we know are so core to who we are as we live together with each other. Fred says it well. We want to raise our children so they take care of the sense of pleasure in both their own heritage and the diversity of others. It's not about any one of us being on top. It's not about chosenness. It's not about supersessionism, right? It's about all of us working together back towards the basic foundation of who we know we are.
The Christian conception of what comes next is driven by this idea of already and not yet. That for Christians, we think that the Messiah might have already shown up. But that the age of God, the kingdom of God, has not yet been fulfilled. Kingdom of God is this really slippery concept in the New Testament. Sometimes it seems like it's here, and sometimes it seems like it's later, and sometimes it seems like it's outside of us, and sometimes Jesus says it's within us. What that means is that there is a kingdom of God that is coming, but that the kingdom of God has started now. And that it's already with us. And that our work is not to create that kingdom, but rather to unveil it, to make it more present in the world around us. And that's what we try to do. And that's what I think Fred tried to do. I love this. Let's take the gauntlet and make goodness attractive in this so-called next millennium. That's the real job we have. I'm not talking about Pollyanna-ish kind of stuff. I'm talking about down-to-earth actual goodness. People caring for each other in a myriad of ways, rather than people knocking each other off all the time. What changes the world? The only thing that ever really changes the world is when somebody gets the idea that love can abound and can be shared. And so our work together is to throw down the gauntlet of goodness.
And so through the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement of the JCC, we are redefining neighbor from a geographic term to a moral concept. That means that it's not good enough just to say, oh yeah, he lives on my block, or he lives in my town, but that I actually care about her. I'm actually going to do something when there are challenges. For example, I'm in conversation now with a leader in the Asian community in Squirrel Hill. Wouldn't you know it, that business in Asian restaurants in Squirrel Hill is down 50%. Right? Because people are afraid. right? That there are Asian residents, right, in Pittsburgh who are getting yelled at through car windows. Go back home. And these kids, according to Marion, who shared this with me, are saying, what do you mean go back home? I'm a Korean American, I was born here. And so we have our work to do still. You never know when, that ugly head is gonna emerge. We learned that concept of redefining neighbor, right, from Rabbi Joachim Prince, who stood with Martin Luther King on that infamous day on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He was there for two reasons. One is because of his friendship with King, they were working side by side in civil rights. And two is because Prince came from Germany. And so he was placed there just before King, right, to give that speech, to say, if we don't do what we need to do, and we don't continue to do what we need to do because the work isn't done, obviously, right, then we're going to wind up like Nazi Germany. And no one wants that. And so that's the work that we do. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do not stand idle while your neighbor leads.
Meanwhile, I serve Christian Associates. This is our 50th anniversary year.
Woo-hoo.
Yay! And it might seem a little odd for an organization that has as its central mission the work of unifying Christians to spend time doing this interfaith relationship building and thinking about Christianity's relationship with other world religions. But in fact, that kind of interfaith connection has been part of our work since its very beginning. That through the relationship building among Christian and Jewish leaders, later also among Muslim leaders, and now among leaders of a wide variety of faiths, we have found ourselves as a voice for the church in those conversations, and as a way to take the best of what we've learned from our neighbors back to our churches to enrich our lives together. So, working in collaboration, the Center for Loving Kindness at the JCC and Christian Associates have cultivated a network of spiritual leaders across Southwest Pennsylvania. About 500 or so spiritual leaders have engaged in our work in one way or another over the last 3 years. They come from 10 different world religions, from 5 expressions of Judaism, 21 different expressions of Christianity, lots and lots of people in the room. It's really exciting.
And when we come into that room, we're doing all kinds of good stuff together. We have hopeful conversations. Conversations about some challenging issues in our world. We've done it on immigration, we've done it on gun violence, on opioid addiction, we've done it on hate. Actually, tomorrow night we're doing one on Census 2020, right, at Squirrel Hill at the JCC at 7 o'clock. So we can learn what role can we play, right, in being able to make sure that every one of our neighbors gets counted. Because it's actually self-serving. The better we do at counting, the more federal funding we have for community endeavors like CCAC.
So these hopeful conversations began for us after the demonstrations in Charlottesville. There was a sense when Charlottesville happened that the kind of values that our faith traditions teach, that we had long thought went unsaid, needed to be articulated very clearly in the public square. And so that was the moment for us when we began drawing people together. We found that conversation changed after October 27th. We actually had a hopeful conversation event scheduled for November 8th. It was going to be just a breakfast for some clergy. We figured we'd get 15 or so clergy in the room. I was nervous on October 26th, and with Friday, I was like, we haven't publicized this at all. Is anyone even going to come? Should we cancel it? And Ron called me on October 28th and said, I think we need to keep that November 8th date because I think we have to talk. So instead of 15 spiritual leaders gathering for breakfast, we welcomed 150 spiritual leaders to the JCC because there was that need for us to connect with one another, to discover what our common ground is, and to identify ways that we might be able to work together going forward for the common good. Oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Okay. So what I think was really cool about those We Have to Talk conversations is that we were bringing people together who had not necessarily shared the same space before. And we were able to build relationships and connections that hadn't previously existed.
So that then, 6 months later, when 300 people died in bomb attacks in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday, the abbot of the Buddhist center could call me. We hadn't known each other beforehand. But he could call me and say, well, my people are mostly from Sri Lanka, and these attacks targeted Christians, so maybe Sri Lankan Buddhists and Christians should work together on some kind of community vigil. And so in 56 hours, working in partnership with over a dozen other organizations from many other faith traditions, we built Heinz Chapel with people who came to mourn together, to support one another, and also to raise funds to help the people of Sri Lanka.
And more locally, when this past summer, there was a bombing attempt of the Legacy International Worship Center on the north side, we went and stood, right, present. Now, we didn't know Reverend Michael Days at that point, but we got to know him. We simply took that gauntlet of goodness and immediately after the news came out, went there with a fruit platter and said, we're here for you, what can we do? And he said, well, can you come to church on Sunday? And so we brought 30 or 40 people, right, to stand, and in the ways that we've seen this also with the Muslim community when there have been attacks after the Christchurch attack, that people stood outside the mosque to say, you're welcome here, just like after October 27th, right? People came to temple a lot, more non-Jews than Jews, right? And that is just so appreciated. So what's really interesting about this is the two women on the left, right, are members of the Jewish community. The woman on the right is a leader in the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ. A connection that, Jews and Mormons? Really? But yeah, when push comes to shove, really, that's who we are.
As we approach the 1 year mark of the October 27th attacks, we organized an event called The Ways We Remember. We invited spiritual leaders from 6 different faith traditions to share a little bit about what grieving and memory looks like in their traditions, to share a prayer or a ritual with us. Then we asked Cliff Chanin, who's on staff at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York, to tell us a little bit about what he'd learned about what grief looks like across communities, and how communities could come together to commemorate the hardest times in their lives.
And just to get a sense, you can tell pretty easily, rabbi, Muslim, Christian pastor, right? We just keep on building out those opportunities for people to reach beyond real and perceived differences.
Ripped right from the headlines, this is today's Post-Gazette.
Since November, we have been bringing groups of interfaith spiritual leaders to the Center for Victims on Pittsburgh's south side. The Center for Victims has developed an innovative experience called Healing Rivers, which is an educational opportunity to learn about trauma and its impact on physical and mental health. What we have discovered is that learning together about trauma is an important way to bridge some of the divides between us. Because all of our faith communities are affected by trauma in one way or another. Some of us might have been directly impacted by the events of October 27th. Others live in neighborhoods where violence and intergenerational poverty and structural racism impact life every day. And others of us do ministry with people who are grieving or who are victims of abuse or have experienced those events in our own lives. And so we've found that learning about trauma is a way for us to connect, even as we're also equipping ourselves to do our ministries better in the places where we're.
One of the core texts that we use for that is a text from Leviticus, a little bit obscure. It's after Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Abihu, were killed by a sacred fire because they misused fire. And we asked the question, did Moses comfort his brother Aaron well after the death of his sons? And some of the best learning has been when Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus, right, give us insights into a text that I've known all my life, right, that maybe is more familiar to me than to you, but to see that outside perspective and for us to be studying that together, and then to be studying the Doubting Thomas text from the Christian Bible, and then to study meditation techniques for after trauma from the Hindu community. All of this is just, it's a part of that gauntlet of goodness. It's part of that sense of we all should be working together in some way to make this happen better. And like I mentioned, Census 2020 is really important to us. It is the most apartisan thing that we can be doing politically, even though it has been partisanized, right? But I want to encourage you that I know that the Census Department here in Allegheny County needs people to work. They are part-time jobs. They pay $23 an hour. They say you do not need a car because they will put you to work on your own block, walking on to knocking on doors, right? Reminding neighbors how the process is going to go. But that's the type of thing that says that every single one of us counts, and so we should be counted.
Yeah, the part of loving our neighbor means making sure that every person gets counted, and that the benefit to our communities is such that that's a really important piece. People ask us sometimes, where do you think all of this is going? What's the end goal of this? And the fact is that while the path forward has become more clear today than it was on, say, October 28th of 2018, there still is a sense when we are in this simply journeying together and discovering each next step as it comes. And as we're discussing that sensation, I was reminded of this prayer from Thomas Merton, one of my favorites, that identifies that sense of trust even though we don't know exactly the end destination. So if you feel comfortable, I invite you to join in these words with us.
My
Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where I went, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me down the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone.
So it's an aspiration that we pray to God, but it's an aspiration that we pray to each other, that we'll never be alone. We don't know what the future has to hold. We don't know what the weather is going to be tomorrow. But together we can figure out what kind of clothing to wear in order to make sure that we're up for it. So we're just grateful that the Monroeville Ministerium is such a beacon of all of this that we've been talking about. Really, like when other parts of Pittsburgh come to us and say, we're having this problem, what should we do? We say, talk to Monroeville. Because the work that your faith leaders have done. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I'm married to a past president of the Monroeville Interfaith Ministerium, right? But the work that your faith leaders have done in this little corner of the world is absolutely amazing. And that's what we're simply trying to spread throughout.
Great. Yeah, so thank you so much for having us here this afternoon. And we're happy to entertain your reflections, your questions, and your thoughts that emerge from what you've heard. Yes.
So the people that come to these types of events are the people who already, for lack of better
we're
wording,
preaching to the choir.
buy into this.
Yes.
My question is, how do we spread it to the community that doesn't, for sake of argument, buy into
So
this?
I used to think that phrase, preaching to the choir, was an insult to people like us, right? Or any one of us, right? That, we're just talking to the same old people who are right there. But I've become convinced that by preaching to the choir, we're going to turn some choir members into preachers, right? So what you need to do is you need to take these words, not because we've shared them, but simply because we're vessels, right, of tradition, of shared work together. And you need to live them out there so that you can actually, when you are in Miracle Mile, right, and you see something that just isn't right, you got to do something about it. Like, I'll give you an example. I had a moment of courage, personal courage. It was small, right? But I was in the locker room at the JCC, right? And some guys were focusing on some Yiddish words. And the Yiddish words that they were focusing on were rather derogatory words about other people. And I said to them, guys, if you're interested in talking about, the evolution of Yiddish, why are you using those words? Why don't you use other words that don't put other people down? And so, I was standing in a towel, right? So it's a lot of courage to do this, right? But yeah, the way that we get to those other people is simply by the way that we throw down the gauntlet of goodness.
Yeah, and I think, I got asked this just last week at a Martin Luther King Day event at Carnegie Mellon. And I think that the work that we're doing, nobody's going to come to one of these presentations and go commit an act of mass violence, right? The people who might do that are not the primary audience of this sort of piece. But the important thing about articulating these values clearly in the public square is about demanding a certain kind of tone for our wider community. Because if people of faith and goodwill never stand together and articulate our shared values, which are values that are across all of our faith traditions by people of faith and by people without faith, then we risk letting those values go unnamed, go assumed, and ultimately take less precedence in the way that we act together. So it's about setting a tone for our wider community.
We also have a bigger dream, so that network of 500, 550 interfaith leaders, some ordained, some not ordained, isn't just in the heart of Pittsburgh. It actually is across all of southwestern Pennsylvania. And so we're beginning to strategically look and see, who do we know? If we see that there's something bad going on out in Apollo, right? Who do we know there, right? That can pull some strings. There we go, right? That can pull some strings, right? And that can be lay some influence on the schools, right, or on the police, right, to make sure that we're going in the right direction.
We're living in a world or a society of extremes now, left and right, hardcore and less core. How do we bridge that gap?
Man, if we knew, this is going to sound really naive, and maybe it will prove to be so. But I continue to think that person-to-person connections are our best hope of human survival, and that the more we can continue stubbornly to recognize shared humanity with people with whom we disagree, the better off we will be.
Just look at us, right? I mean, just by looking out and around, I think that we're Hindus, we're Jews, and we're Christians, right? 20 years ago, would we be able to sit in this space together?
And Baha'i.
And Baha'i. Thank you very much.
This is a wonderful way of meeting and actually exchanging the ideas. However, since you are the head of Western Pennsylvania, all 7 counties, 10 counties, all Christian churches, I want to ask you, how do you get rid of the root cause of this problem? And I'll tell you what I think. Okay? I mean, everyone has a different idea of how the root cause are. I think 90% of this problem in the world are caused by religious differences, either it is Sudan, South and West, or East and West Timor. I have been watching geopolitical, how it works. And I don't want to name every religion here where I see the problems are. But since you are the head of this 10 county, at least you society probably know how the teaching is going around in every church in this Western Pennsylvania area. Do you control all the missionaries they produce?
No.
They are the soldiers of the God, and they go all over the world, and they are the part, because when Afghanistan was bombarded and they relieved some of the prisoners from the jail. Started coming out, and I used to subscribe in those days, Wall Street Journal. And there were horrible stories because these people, eventually, what happened was, I'm just going to tell a story exactly what happened. Christian missionaries become a part of the United Nations employees. And they used to work in Afghanistan. During their time, either they were from Germany or they were from the United States, there were few from our corner here too. They used to break the grain and whatever needed to be. At night time, they were showing the movies in some homes about how bad Islam is, basically. And Afghanistan had a religious police. That's something new I learned in those days, that religious police also, who were watching these kind of people, and then few of them were put into jail. And one of the person from our area got released when the US Army bombarded those people and released those prisoners. This is one of the true stories, and I know many other stories my hands in other.
So, how does that impact the work that you do here?
So, what kind of work can you do to prevent producing any missionary figure?
Yeah. So I would be the first to say that Christian mission has been a decidedly mixed blessing to the world, and that there have been many instances where people who perhaps sincerely thought they were acting in the name of God have wound up causing grievous harm to people, have worked hand in hand with forces of colonialism, racism, and other forces. So that's true. I think many of our religious traditions have been used for ill as much as they've been used for good. That people have died in wars inspired by religions, inspired by pretty much every religion that there is. And so I think that here locally, so my work here is very regional, and I sort of sit as the servant of the leaders of the different Christian churches. So I don't have a lot of like personal authority to do much of that stuff. But I do think that it's on each religious tradition to do the self-examination and to think about how we have not lived up to our ideals, and to examine our practices, whether those are practices of mission and evangelism, or whether those are practices of serving the poor, or whether those are practices of our liturgy or our preaching. When have those meshed with our best values, and when have those not? And when they haven't, to do that work of rooting that out. And I think we see that a lot in the Christian-Jewish relationship too, as we look at the historical anti-Semitism in Christianity, and at today's Islamophobia in Christianity, and at the ways that Christianity has intersected with native religions. So yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, so we have a colleague at the Center for Victims, Reverend Darnell Drury, who taught us that what we need more of is people moving from speaking the message to being the model. And so we hope that in some small way, by our coming together today, that each one of us is going to grow into being that model through our actions. There are ways that you can stay connected to us. So I don't think that we did a sign-in sheet, did we? No. So we probably should do that. And then with your permission, we'll put you on our list so that we can send you the materials of things that are coming in and going. We'll set that up at the table over there. You can go online to CASP.org, Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, get on their mailing list. You can go to the Center for Loving Kindness at the JCC online, get on the mailing list, and let's just figure out how it is that we can do this from a regional level, take the goodness that actually is already deeply planted here in Monroeville because of the ministerium, and try to spread that even beyond.
Sure.
You have handouts for
Yes,
this.
ma'am, we'll put them over there.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
sure.
All right.
So thank you
Super.
all so
Thank
much.
you all so much.